the final Sunday in our series called It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, focusing on the theology of Mr. Rogers, we are turning to the Gospel according to John in the 11th chapter. The entire 11th chapter is the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus and their relationship with Jesus. And we're not going to read the entire chapter, just one section from that story. So in the story already, we have learned that Lazarus has died and Jesus has been summoned to the town where he was. And upon coming to the town, encounters Mary and Martha. And just picking it up in verse 28 then. When she had said this, Martha went back and called to her sister Mary, told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." When she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The people who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and all the people who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. So the people said, "See how he loved him." Some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" And this is a word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. One last time. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. Always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, could you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please, won't you be my neighbor? Good morning, neighbor. So, would you believe me if I told you that Mr. Rogers got mad? Would you believe me if I told you that Mr. Rogers ever felt anger? Well, he did. But of course, it was Mr. Rogers feeling anger. So as he felt his anger, he was also trying to teach you. Do you remember how good it felt to slam down a phone if you were mad? We have lost something essential in the cell phone age, because you can't slam down your cell phone like that. I mean, did you feel that? Watch. It's perfectly coordinated with the song, of course, but that slamming down of the phone, doesn't that feel good? I'm telling you. This song is one of the most performed songs on the whole series. He sang it over 35 times over the course of the years. He sang it on Jay Leno when he appeared on Jay Leno's show. It is a song that continues on in the current series, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Daniel Tiger, the animated series, still on PBS. He sings this song. And in fact, it was the words of this song that Fred Rogers spoke during his Senate testimony. He was called to testify before the United States Senate early on in the formation of the public broadcasting service when they were debating whether or not they should budget for public broadcasting. He was called as a witness, and he quoted the lines of this song as one of the things that was so important about his show and about public broadcasting, teaching kids how to deal with their emotions. And as he quoted the song, the senator who was the chairperson of the committee who had come into the hearing against the idea said, "Well, Rogers, I think you just got your $20 million. What do you do with the mad that you feel?" My favorite part, the most profound part of the song for me, is that idea that I can stop when I want to. If I know that this feeling is mine, it means I can stop the harm that might come from that feeling. How aware of our feelings are we? Awareness of one's feelings is certainly good for one's mental health as well as for one's spiritual health. The two are very closely related. I learned a great phrase this week, emotional granularity. How many of you know what emotional granularity is? Well, I'm about to teach you. Emotional granularity has to do with your ability to distinguish among various shades of different emotion. And so what you do is you map your valence and your arousal. Taking notes? Because there is going to be a test at the end of this sermon. You map your valence and your arousal. So valence is the line of positive to negative, pleasure to displeasure, and your arousal is from high to low. So you can identify the nuance and specificity of your emotions. If you're just mad, that's one thing. But if you're tense, that's another. If you're furious, that's another. So you can have all different shades of positive to negative valence and high to low arousal. If you're happy, that's one thing. If you're chipper, that's another. If you're contented, that's yet another, right? So we have all of these various ways to be able to name our emotions. That's emotional granularity. And if we can be aware of and name our different emotions, we will be healthier people. Why does this matter? Well, as Mr. Rogers says, anything that's human is mentionable. And that's a big statement right there. Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable is more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk will help us know that we are not alone. And if we can make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we have done a great service for mental health. John himself clearly thought that feelings were mentionable and manageable. He mentions the feelings of Jesus multiple times throughout his gospel, including in chapter 11, the part we read today. Jesus was closely related, closely connected to Mary and Martha and Lazarus, the siblings who were dear friends of his. And word came to Jesus that Lazarus was ill and that he was very near to death. There were many who feared he would die. And yet Jesus did not go to visit Lazarus at that time. He remained where he was for a few more days until Lazarus did die. At that time, Jesus said, let's go to Judea and let's visit them. It was a dangerous trip for them to take because the leaders of Judea were out to get Jesus by this point. They were looking for ways to trap him and arrest him and get him out of their hair. So his disciples were a little bit afraid about the prospects of going to visit Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But he said, we got to go. This is what we've got to do. And it was Thomas, ultimately, who said, if he's going to die, then let's all of us go and die with him. Yeah, doubting Thomas said that. And so they went. And obviously, when they arrived, they received the news that Lazarus was dead. They came out before Jesus got to the town. They came out to tell him he was dead. And then Martha went back to Mary and said, Jesus is close. He's on his way. He said he wants to see you. So Mary runs out there, and boy, what a scene, right? If you had only been here, she says. I imagine her grabbing him by the lapels, if robes had lapels. If you had only been here, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus is moved. He's greatly disturbed in spirit, deeply moved. Jesus feels the emotion of this moment. Martha's grief, Mary's grief, the grief of the community gathered around them. He feels that emotion and he expresses it. Jesus begins to weep. Jesus begins to weep. King James Version, Jesus wept. Our favorite verse to memorize as children because it was only 2 words and therefore the easiest one. This is it. This is it. Jesus weeps and goes to the tomb, and we know the story and how it ends. Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb, and he is resuscitated and comes to live again. Jesus expresses what's going on inside of him. Jesus expresses his emotion and feeling. What a great word that is, though, express, to press out, so that it doesn't just stay in there festering and bubbling over, going over and over the same negative feelings that you have. He expresses what he feels. And not just in this grief moment, Jesus feels things consistently throughout the Gospels. Jesus feels empathy for other people's pain. Jesus feels frustration at the disciples' lack of understanding. Jesus feels indignation at the oppression of the poor he sees all around him. Jesus feels anger at the hypocrisy of sanctimonious religious leaders. Jesus feels compassion for the hungry, the homeless, the leper, the lost. Jesus feels joy as he weaves jokes, even funny stories, into his teaching. I mean, do you think a camel through the eye of a needle is supposed to be serious? I actually was looking for anytime Jesus laughed in the gospel, and as it turns out, he doesn't. It's not recorded that he actually laughed anywhere in the gospel. But one of the commentaries I was reading this week was saying Jesus had to have laughed. First of all, we know Jesus was fully human, and so humans laugh. But the second thing he said was, this commentator said, Jesus carried children in his arms. And what child wants to be around someone who never laughs? The best interpretation of Scripture I've ever heard as to whether Jesus actually laughed before. He feels all the feels because he's human, and he expresses them over and over again. If we want to be spiritually healthy, mentioning and managing our feelings is an important part of how we do that. Pressing them out of us so that they're in the air, so we can see them, we can deal with them. Just noticing how we're feeling and owning that goes a long way to our emotional health, which is closely connected to our spiritual health, which, by the way, is closely connected to our physical health as well. Mind, body, and spirit are woven together very, very closely. Freud said, unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in an uglier way. Unexpressed emotions never die. Feeling all the feels, mentioning them, managing them, owning our feelings requires great strength, doesn't it? People who are reticent to show their emotion are not being strong. I'm just going to be strong, not display my emotion here. People who are reticent to show their emotion are just not as healthy as they could be if they would. It takes a great deal of strength to own your feelings, to name them aloud, and to live into them. Again, as Mr. Rogers said, confronting our feelings and giving them appropriate expression always takes strength, not weakness. It takes strength to acknowledge our anger, and sometimes more strength yet to curb the aggressive urges anger may bring and channel them into nonviolent outlets. It takes strength to face our sadness and to grieve and to let our grief and our anger flow in tears when they need to. It takes strength to talk about our feelings and to reach out for help and comfort when we need it. In September of 2002, Mr. Rogers recorded several public service announcements. It was the one-year anniversary of the terrorist attacks of September 2001, and there were several public service announcements that came out. Mr. Rogers just sitting there and talking to us about how we feel about the events, and in particular, how we help children to understand their feelings around all they're hearing in the news. He talked about how we have ample evidence in the world of what happens when people do not have healthy expressions of their anger. Ample evidence in the world when people are unsure how to mention and manage their feelings about this, that, or the other thing. He spoke words of hope and encouragement. And he said that I'm convinced if we help our children find healthy ways of dealing with their feelings, ways that don't hurt them or anyone else, we're helping to make our world a safer and better place. There is no better way to end this message nor to end this series on Mr. Rogers' theology than by letting him have the final word.
You know, it happens so often. I walk down the street and someone 20 or 30 or 40 years old will come up to me and say, "You are Mr. Rogers, aren't you?" And then they tell me about growing up with the neighborhood and how they're passing on to the children they know what they found to be important in our television work. Like expressing their feelings through music and art and dance and sports and drama and computers and writing, and invariably we end our little time together with a hug. I'm just so proud of all of you who have grown up with us, and I know how tough it is some days to look with hope and confidence on the months and years ahead. But I would like to tell you what I often told you when you were much younger. I like you just the way you are. And what's more, I'm so grateful to you for helping the children in your life to know that you'll do everything you can to keep them safe and to help them express their feelings in ways that will bring healing in many different neighborhoods. It's such a good feeling to know that we're lifelong friends.